Snow was falling so hard it seemed to erase the world. Chicago's skyline was just a blur of white and shadow, swallowed whole by the storm. Streetlights flickered through the curtain of snow like dying embers, and wind clawed at everything it touched. Inside a small 24-hour diner near Michigan Avenue, the world felt still. Warm light spilling over red vinyl booths, the soft hiss of coffee on the burner, and the hum of an old jazz tune leaking through the speakers. It was the kind of place where time held its breath. Adrian Vale sat alone at the corner booth, his coat draped neatly beside him, his phone screen glowing with stock reports and late-night emails. 42 years old, face carved by ambition, eyes sharp enough to silence a room, he was a man built entirely from control. Every movement, every breath, every deal followed precision. The snow outside didn't bother him. Storms never did. He had weathered worse, market crashes, lawsuits, betrayals, and learned that emotion was weakness. But even men like Adrian Vale couldn't command the night to behave. The bell over the door jolted everyone. It clanged once, hard, followed by a burst of wind that chased in a swirl of snow. Heads turned. A small figure stumbled inside. A girl, maybe 9, wrapped in a soaked coat 2 sizes too big, her shoes leaking water onto the floor. Her hair clung to her cheeks in frozen strands. She clutched a canvas bag to her chest like a secret she couldn't afford to lose. For a long heartbeat, nobody moved. The waitress behind the counter hesitated, torn between sympathy and the manager's rules. The only sound was the wind whining against the windows and the squeak of the door as it swung shut behind her. The girl's voice came small, but steady. "Please, sir," she said, her gaze fixed on the floor. "1 bowl of noodles. I can wash dishes." She didn't beg with tears. She spoke like someone asking for permission to exist. Adrian looked up. Something inside him, something long buried under years of profit and polish, shifted. The people in the diner avoided her eyes, the way people do when they don't want to admit their own comfort. But Adrian couldn't look away. There was something in her tone, that strange mix of fear and pride, that made his chest tighten. He set his phone down. The screen dimmed to black. The waitress started to say something, about closing time, about policy, but Adrian raised a hand. "She'll eat," he said quietly. "Bring her noodles. Make it hot." His voice, calm and commanding, left no room for argument. The woman nodded and hurried off. Mira moved to a booth across from him, careful not to drip snow on the seat. Her fingers trembled as she removed her bag and placed it beside her like it contained her whole world. When the steaming bowl arrived, she whispered a thank you so soft it was nearly lost beneath the hiss of the coffee pot. Adrian watched as she took her first bite, cautious at first, then hungry. Each mouthful looked like relief and guilt all at once. He found himself leaning forward, forgetting his emails, forgetting himself. For years, Adrian had prided himself on his ability to read markets, not people. But watching her now, this child who ate as though every second mattered, he felt something foreign stirring. Memory, maybe, or regret? The rhythm of her small hands, the quiet gratitude in every movement. It disarmed him. He'd built an empire out of glass and steel, yet he couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at him with the kind of honesty she did. Outside, the wind roared against the windows, but inside the diner, the world had narrowed to the space between them. The billionaire who had everything, and the girl who had nothing but hope enough to ask. When she lifted her eyes at last, meeting his, it wasn't to plead. It was to say without words, "Thank you for seeing me, Adrian Vale," who had spent a lifetime untouched by storms, realized with quiet disbelief that the one he feared most had already begun, inside his own heart. The storm worsened as the night deepened, and the city became a painting erased by white. The diner's neon sign flickered like a failing heartbeat, its light trembling over the window glass. Inside, the girl ate as if she were afraid time might take her food away. Every small sound she made, the clink of the spoon, the whisper of breath between bites, seemed to fill the silence no one dared to break. Adrian Vale sat motionless, the steam from his untouched coffee fogging his reflection in the window. He'd spent his life in boardrooms and glass towers, building systems so precise that even the smallest flaw could be erased with a signature. Yet here was something he couldn't calculate: hunger that trembled, gratitude that didn't beg, and eyes that carried a storm older than the one outside. He felt it press against his ribs, that unfamiliar ache. The waitress slipped the bill beneath his plate, her voice soft. "That little one came by last week, too. We gave her soup once, but the boss said we can't keep feeding strays." Adrian's jaw tightened. Stray. The word cut through him. He looked back at the girl. She was licking the last of the broth, careful, polite, as if even survival required permission. "Keep her warm," he said, his voice low. "And bring her something sweet. A small treat." The waitress hesitated, then nodded, sensing something in his tone that wasn't open for debate. When the girl finished, she didn't look around for approval. She placed the spoon carefully beside the bowl and folded her hands, whispering what might have been a prayer. Then she stood clutching her bag again. Adrian noticed her shoes, thin canvas, torn at the seams, soaked to her ankles. He stood too. "Where are you going?" he asked. She startled at the sound of his voice. "Back," she murmured. "Back where?" "Home." Her tone carried the weight of something that wasn't real. The snow hit the glass in bursts, howling like it wanted her back. Adrian exhaled slowly. "Wait," he said. He took a billfold from his pocket and placed a crisp note on the table. "Let me have my driver take you." She shook her head fiercely, clutching her bag tighter. "No, he'll find me if I ride in cars." The words froze him. He didn't know who he was, but he didn't ask. Not yet. Her fear was too raw, too rehearsed. He knew that kind of fear. Not personally, but from the eyes of the broken people his empire had sometimes crushed without intention. Adrian slipped his coat from the seat. "Then you'll walk with me," she blinked, confused. Why? He didn't have an answer that made sense. "Because it's cold," he said finally. When they stepped outside, the wind hit like a wall. She leaned into it, her small figure nearly swallowed by snow. He placed his coat around her shoulders. It hung to her knees, ridiculous but warm. She hesitated, then tugged it closer, her lips quivering. "You don't have to," she said again. He looked down at her, a flicker of stubborn pride in a world that had given her nothing. "Maybe I do," he said. They walked toward the corner, where his car waited like a silent shadow. Through the swirling snow, the city looked fragile, almost human. The chauffeur opened the door without a word, his eyes flicking from the billionaire to the trembling child. Adrian guided her in. For a moment, she resisted, staring into the leather interior as if it were another world she didn't belong in. Then she climbed inside, the heat wrapping her in invisible arms. As the car pulled away, she pressed her forehead to the glass, watching the snow blur the streets she knew too well. "Does it always snow this much?" she asked quietly. "Sometimes," Adrian said, "but not forever." Her eyes reflected the streetlights, two small galaxies flickering with both fear and wonder. "Nothing lasts forever," she whispered. He didn't know it yet, but those words would follow him long after the storm ended, echoing in boardrooms, in quiet mornings, and in the heart he was only just beginning to remember he had. "You said—" The limousine hummed softly through the snow-choked streets, its headlights carving narrow tunnels of light through the storm. The city outside was barely recognizable, the skyline buried under white, the road silent but for the low growl of engines pushing against nature's breath. Inside, warmth cocooned them. The heater whispered, melting the frost from the windows, but Adrian still felt the chill, not from the storm, but from the silence that filled the car. Mira sat across from him, dwarfed by the leather seat, Adrian's coat draped around her like armor she hadn't earned but desperately needed. Her small hands fidgeted with the torn strap of her bag, eyes darting to the passing blur outside. He could see the exhaustion in her face, not just physical, but the kind that comes from running too long, too young. He wanted to ask where she lived, who she belonged to, but something in her posture stopped him. Every time she blinked, he saw caution, the kind of reflex born from experience, not innocence. He'd seen that same guardedness in investors, rivals, and himself. Yet it was different on her. Tragic, pure. The driver spoke softly. "Mr. Vale, should I take you home?" Adrian's eyes stayed on the girl. "No, the peninsula." The driver didn't question it. He'd learned not to. The rest of the ride passed in silence. Occasionally, the car hit a patch of ice, jolting them forward slightly. Each time, Mira's hand twitched, not out of fear of the car, but of the world beyond it. When the vehicle finally pulled into the hotel's private entrance, the doorman rushed forward, his uniform dusted with snow. He froze when he saw Adrian step out, and then noticed the child following behind him. But Adrian didn't explain. He didn't owe anyone an explanation tonight. The lobby glowed gold and silent, marble floors shining like mirrors. Chandeliers dripped light from the ceiling, reflecting on the snow melting from Mira's shoes. Guests turned to stare, puzzled by the sight, a billionaire in an Italian coat walking beside a shivering girl in rags. Adrian ignored them all. He signed for the suite, his tone clipped and calm, but his hand trembled slightly as he pressed the pen to paper. When they reached the suite, Mira stopped at the door, unsure whether she was allowed to enter. He gestured her in gently. "You're safe here," he said. That word, safe, seemed foreign to her, like something she didn't believe in anymore. Still, she stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of cedar and warmth. Through the tall windows, the city glowed dimly beneath the snowstorm. Mira stood frozen in the middle of the room, her bag pressed to her chest. Adrian loosened his tie. "You should change out of those wet clothes. The bathroom's there." She didn't move. Her eyes flicked toward the door as if she was waiting for the trick, the condition, the danger that always followed kindness. Adrian noticed it and softened his tone. "It's all right. I'll stay here. You can lock the door." For the first time, she looked directly at him. It wasn't trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. When she emerged minutes later, wrapped in a robe far too large for her, her hair damp and clean, she looked younger, smaller, almost human again. He'd ordered soup and milk from room service. She hesitated when the tray arrived, eyes darting between him and the food. "You can eat," he said gently. She nodded and sat cross-legged on the floor, as though a chair were too much luxury to ask for. Her small hands cupped the bowl, and she took careful sips, blowing on each one as though afraid to waste even the steam. Adrian watched her in silence. He thought of his own childhood, long buried under boardrooms and ambition. The housekeeper who used to sneak him cookies when his father was in meetings. The warmth that vanished when business replaced family. He hadn't thought about her in decades. Until now. "Do you have anyone?" he asked quietly. Mira's hand paused halfway to her mouth. Her eyes didn't rise. "I used to." He wanted to ask more, but the answer lingered like a bruise. Instead, he said, "You can stay here tonight. Just tonight." She nodded, but there was no relief in her face, only disbelief, as if she'd heard promises like that before, the kind that disappeared by morning. When she finally fell asleep on the couch, curled into the robe, her breathing small and uneven, Adrian stood by the window, staring out into the falling snow. The city looked so peaceful from up here. A lie of light and glass. Down below, thousands of others like her wandered unseen, unnoticed. He thought about the decisions he'd made, the factories automated, the jobs lost, the neighborhoods forgotten. His empire had built skylines but swallowed lives. And now, for the first time, one of those lives had found its way back to him, shivering in a diner, asking only for noodles. He turned from the window and looked at the sleeping girl. The coat still hung from her shoulders, slipping slightly as she breathed. Something inside him twisted. Something he couldn't name yet, but it felt like the first crack in the armor he'd spent a lifetime forging. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Adrian Vale, the man who never stayed anywhere longer than necessary, realized he didn't want this night to end. Morning broke softly over Chicago, though the city was still wrapped in frost. The storm had spent itself overnight, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed sacred. From the window of the hotel suite, Adrian Vale watched the first pale rays touch the snow-coated rooftops, painting them gold for a moment before fading into the gray haze. The city was beautiful from this height, clean, orderly, far away. Almost peaceful. Behind him, the faint rustle of blankets stirred the quiet. Mira was awake. She sat up slowly on the couch, rubbing her eyes with small fists, blinking at the brightness as if she'd woken into a dream she didn't trust yet. Adrian turned. For a heartbeat, he saw her as something fragile, a child caught between fear and wonder. And something in his chest tightened. "Good morning," he said, his voice gentler than he remembered it could be. She hesitated, then nodded. "Is it still snowing?" He shook his head. It stopped. Her shoulders dropped a little, some invisible weight loosening its grip. She swung her legs off the couch, feet touching the soft carpet, looking down as if afraid to leave footprints. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Mira looked unsure, then whispered, "I don't want to trouble you." He frowned. "You won't." Room service arrived minutes later. Pancakes, fruit, warm milk. Mira's eyes widened at the sight, but she didn't move until he nodded. Then she began to eat in slow, reverent bites, her small hands clumsy with the silverware. Adrian sat across from her, pretending to read his phone, though his eyes never left her. She didn't speak much, but the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was alive. After breakfast, she placed her fork down carefully, wiped her mouth with the corner of a napkin, and whispered, "Thank you, sir." He looked up. "You can call me Adrian," she tilted her head. "Adrian," she repeated softly, testing it like it might break. That sounds kind. The word startled him, not because of what she said, but how she said it. With sincerity. With the sort of honesty no one had used around him in years. He cleared his throat, unsettled. "You should rest. My driver will take you wherever you need to go." Her expression changed. The fear returned, creeping up like a shadow. "No, please. Not there. He'll be angry." "Who?" Her gaze dropped to the carpet. "My father." The words came out like a secret she wished she hadn't spoken. Adrian leaned forward, his voice low. "Does he hurt you?" She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. She clutched the fabric of the robe like armor. Adrian exhaled slowly, pressing his palms together. The old version of himself would have ended it there, called child services, written a donation, washed his hands clean. But that man felt foreign now, irrelevant. He couldn't let her go back into the cold. Not to that. "You're safe here," he said finally. "You don't have to go back." Her eyes lifted, dark, cautious, searching. "People always say that," she murmured. "Then they send me away anyway." Adrian didn't answer. He simply nodded once. "Then I won't say it again." "I'll show you." She didn't smile, but something flickered behind her eyes, the smallest ember of belief. Later that day, he made a call. His assistant, Clara, picked up immediately. "You missed the board briefing," she said. "Investors are asking questions." "Tell them I'll handle it later," Adrian replied. "Later?" She repeated, incredulous. "You never say later." "I'm saying it now." He hung up before she could respond. When he turned, Mira was standing near the window, her small hand pressed against the glass. "It looks different from up here," she said. "Like the city's pretending to be kind." Adrian walked to her side. "Maybe it is," he said quietly. "At least today." They stood together in silence, the skyline stretching before them. For the first time in years, Adrian didn't feel above the world. He felt within it. As night fell again, he brought her to his penthouse on Lakeshore Drive. She sat in the back seat, eyes wide as the car cut through the quiet streets. The building rose out of the snow like a monument, tall, glass, impersonal. He'd always liked it that way. But as the doors opened and they stepped inside, he felt an unexpected embarrassment at its emptiness, the sterile perfection of a man who had built walls to hide behind. He led her to a guest room. Pale walls, clean sheets, a window overlooking the frozen lake. "You can stay here," he said. She looked around, then back at him. "It's too clean," she said. "It doesn't feel real." He almost laughed. "Maybe that's the problem." When she disappeared behind the door, he stood in the hall for a long time, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards as she moved. For the first time in years, his house didn't sound empty. But that night, as he poured himself a drink and stared at the reflection of the snow in his window, a thought crept into his mind, one that made his stomach twist. Somewhere out there, someone knew she was missing, and they were going to come for her. The knock came 2 nights later, heavy, deliberate, and far too familiar. It broke through the hush of the penthouse like a warning. Adrian had been in his study, the only lighted desk lamp haloing over papers he hadn't read, thoughts he couldn't settle. When he heard the knock, he froze. It wasn't the polite tap of a concierge or delivery man. It was the kind of sound that carried anger inside it. He opened the door. The man standing there looked like a ghost carved from the city's darker corners. Mid-30s, unshaven, jacket soaked from the lingering sleet, eyes bloodshot with something more than exhaustion. His breath smelled of whiskey and wind. Behind him, the hallway lights buzzed. "You've got my kid," he said flatly. Adrian didn't move. His instinct was to measure, to calculate, to find leverage, but the word kid stripped away the boardroom reflex. "Your daughter?" he asked quietly. The man's lips curled. "Don't play smart, Vale. The little beggar girl? Mira? You think the city doesn't talk?" The way he said her name, like ownership, not love, sent a tremor through Adrian's chest. "She's here," Adrian said finally, voice even. "And safe. That's more than I can say for what you gave her." The man laughed harshly. "Safe? You stole her. You think money makes you a savior?" He stepped closer, the smell of alcohol hitting like static. "You people always want something to fix, so you can feel human for 5 minutes." Adrian's expression didn't change, but the words landed deep. "She asked for food," he said. "You left her to starve." "She's my blood," the man shouted, slamming a hand against the wall. "Not your project." From the hallway behind Adrian, a small voice trembled. "Papa?" Mira stood barefoot at the edge of the corridor, her hair tangled from sleep, eyes wide and wet. For a heartbeat, she looked like she wanted to run forward. And then she saw the way her father's shoulders twitched, the wildness in his stare. She took a step back. "You," he said, pointing at her. "Get your things." She didn't move. "Mira," Adrian said softly, "go to your room." Her small frame trembled. "He'll hurt you." Adrian turned his gaze on the man, and for once, the billionaire's calm became something sharper, not the cold precision of business, but the controlled fury of a man who'd finally remembered what it meant to protect. "You're not taking her anywhere tonight," he said. The man's grin faltered. "You don't get to decide that." "I do," Adrian said, "until the law says otherwise." Something in his tone, steady, final, made the man's jaw tighten. He spat on the floor, muttered a curse, and stalked away down the hall. The elevator dinged and he was gone, swallowed by the quiet. Adrian stood there a moment, breathing through the ache in his chest. Then he shut the door, the sound echoing through the empty penthouse. Mira was still by the wall, trembling. He went to her slowly, crouching so they were level. "He's gone," he said. Her voice cracked. "He always comes back." He wanted to tell her he wouldn't let that happen, that she'd never have to see fear that way again. But promises had failed her before. So he didn't speak them. He simply said, "You're safe here tonight," and wrapped her small shoulders in his coat. Later, when she'd fallen asleep curled on the couch beside the dying fire, Adrian stood by the window again. Chicago glowed below, indifferent, endless. He could almost hear the headlines forming in the dark. Billionaire harboring child in penthouse scandal. He'd spent his life avoiding risk, mastering control. But for the first time, he didn't care about consequences. He called his attorney at dawn. "Find me everything you can on a custody petition," he said. The line went silent. "You're serious?" Adrian looked toward the couch, where Mira slept beneath his coat, the faint rise and fall of her breath steady against the morning light. I've never been more serious, he said. Because something had changed. Not just in his house, but in him. He had saved her from the cold. Now he'd have to save her from the world. The courtroom smelled of varnish and tension. That sterile kind of air that clings to places where judgment is handed down. Cameras flashed outside, muffled behind the heavy oak doors. The world had decided this was entertainment. Billionaire steals beggar girl, hero or hypocrite. Headlines fed on his silence, twisting compassion into scandal. But Adrian Vale wasn't here to protect his name anymore. He was here for her. Mira sat at the end of the bench beside him, her small legs dangling, shoes too big, eyes too old. She clutched the corner of her sketchbook like it was armor. Every so often, she'd glance up at him, and he'd give a faint nod. The same silent promise he'd given since that night in the diner. You're safe. I'm here. Across the aisle, her father slouched in his chair, a smirk playing under his unshaven jaw. His lawyer, a thin man with the smile of a vulture, shuffled his papers and whispered something that made the father laugh quietly. Adrian's own attorney, Nora Fields, leaned toward him. He's going to paint you as a kidnapper, she said softly. A man trying to buy redemption with someone else's child. Adrian adjusted his cufflinks. Then we'll give him the truth. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The room settled into heavy silence, broken only by the hum of a ceiling fan and the shuffle of shoes. The father's lawyer began first. Your Honor, this case isn't complicated. My client, Mr. Morales, is the biological father of the child in question. The defendant, Mr. Vale, took her without authorization, paraded her through his penthouse, and manipulated her affection. This, he gestured toward Adrian, isn't guardianship. It's a billionaire's fantasy of playing God. The words drew murmurs from the crowd. Adrian's jaw tightened, but his gaze never left the man who called himself a father. When it was Nora's turn, her voice carried like tempered glass, calm, unbreakable. What Mr. Morales calls fantasy, we call survival. The child was found alone in a snowstorm, underfed, injured, and terrified. We have medical reports, teacher testimony, and photographs of her living conditions. Mr. Vale didn't abduct her. He saved her. The father scoffed. Saved her? You think I wanted her out in that storm? You think I'm some monster? Nora didn't flinch. Then perhaps you can explain the bruises on her arms. The man shifted, his voice rising. You rich people think you can judge the poor. I did what I had to. Adrian stood then, his chair scraping softly against the marble floor. You had a choice, he said, his voice low but steady. You chose to hurt her. Sit down, Mr. Vale, the judge warned, though his tone wasn't harsh. Adrian remained standing. No, Your Honor. I've sat down for too many years while people like him blamed the world for their cruelty. He looked toward Mira, whose eyes had filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. I'm not here for pity. I'm here because no child should have to beg for food while the rest of us debate ownership. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Even the reporters forgot to type. The judge exhaled slowly. We'll hear from the child now, he said. Mira froze. Adrian bent down, his voice a whisper. You can do this. Just tell the truth. She nodded once, then stepped forward, clutching her sketchbook. Her voice was barely above a breath. I used to live where it was cold all the time, she said. Not just outside and inside, too. My mom, she used to make soup. But when she died, he stopped cooking. He stopped. Everything. Her eyes flicked toward her father, then back down. Sometimes I'd hide under the sink, because when he got angry, he'd forget I was a kid. Her father muttered something under his breath, but the judge silenced him with a glare. Mira opened the sketchbook and held up a drawing. 3 figures stood under a snowstorm, one small, one tall, and one with wings. This is me, she said softly, pointing to the small one. This is my mom. And this? Her voice trembled. This is Adrian. He's the one who stopped the storm. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't divided by class, by wealth, by cynicism. It was just human. The judge leaned forward, his voice gentler now. Do you want to stay with him, Mira? She nodded, a tear escaping. "Please." "He keeps the light on when I'm scared." No one spoke after that. When the gavel finally came down, it sounded less like judgment and more like mercy. "Full custody granted to Mr. Vale," the judge said. Adrian closed his eyes for just a moment, then felt small hands slip into his. Mira was already standing beside him, whispering through her tears. "We're safe now." Outside, the press swarmed. Questions flew like hailstones, flashes burned like lightning, but he shielded her with his arm and walked through it all. Steady, untouchable. This time, power didn't mean control. It meant protection. As they reached the car, Mira leaned against him, her voice a sleepy murmur. "You didn't let them take me." He looked down at her and answered quietly, "I never will." And as they drove through the thawing streets of Chicago, Adrian realized that somewhere between the blizzard and the courtroom, the man he'd been, the one built of iron and isolation, had melted away. What remained was something far stronger, a father. Chicago began to thaw. The lake still wore a thin veil of ice, but sunlight now glinted off its edges like a promise. Days passed quietly in Adrian Vale's penthouse. The same walls that had once echoed with silence now carried the sound of laughter, of pencils scratching paper, of life rediscovering itself. Mira had claimed the guest room as her own, though Adrian secretly stopped calling it that. The walls bloomed with her drawings, scenes of warmth and color that pushed against the gray outside. Every morning she'd sit by the window, sketching the sunrise with a concentration so fierce it seemed like prayer. And every time Adrian passed by her door, he'd pause, just to watch that small act of peace he'd once believed impossible. Mrs. Adler, his longtime housekeeper, noticed the change too. One afternoon, as she folded laundry near the kitchen island, she said softly, "You're smiling more, sir." Adrian looked up from the newspaper. "Am I?" "Yes," she said, eyes kind but sharp. And not the polite kind. The real kind. He didn't answer, but she didn't need him to. The evidence was everywhere. The open curtains, the books left half-read, the untouched phone calls from board members who still wondered why their CEO hadn't returned to his usual rhythm of empire building. Instead of meetings, Adrian spent his mornings walking Mira to school. She'd skip slightly ahead, her new boots crunching on salt-dusted sidewalks, her breath forming little clouds in the crisp air. The first day he dropped her off, she'd clung to his hand outside the gate, her fingers trembling. "What if they don't like me?" she whispered. "They will," he said gently. "And even if they don't, that doesn't change who you are." She looked up, uncertain. "Who am I then?" He smiled, the quiet kind that carries truth instead of answers. "Someone brave enough to ask that question." She smiled back, and for the first time, walked through the gates without looking back. That night, the house felt strange without her. Adrian found himself pacing the living room, checking the clock as if waiting for a board vote that never came. When she returned, bursting through the door with color on her hands and a story tumbling from her mouth, he listened, really listened, and realized that this was what success sounded like. Not applause, not profit, but laughter echoing in a place that used to be hollow. As weeks passed, his old life began to knock again. Calls from investors, invitations to galas, requests for interviews about the billionaire with a conscience. But he ignored most of them until one evening, he agreed to appear at a televised business forum. The topic was leadership and legacy. He stood before the crowd of polished executives and bright lights, his usual armor, the tailored suit, the measured tone, in place. But when he began to speak, something inside him refused to follow the old script. "I used to think leadership was about control," he said. "The ability to bend the world to your will. But then, one winter night, I met someone who reminded me that control isn't strength. Compassion is." The audience stilled. Cameras clicked. Somewhere, a journalist whispered the phrase, "the empire of warmth," and it would become the headline that followed him for months. When Adrian returned home that night, the living room lights were still on. Mira had fallen asleep on the couch, surrounded by crayons and open pages. One drawing caught his eye. 3 figures standing under a bright yellow sun. Above them, in her careful, uneven handwriting, were the words, "We're safe now." He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For a long time, he just watched her sleep, marveling at how something so small had rebuilt something so broken inside him. But peace has a way of awakening purpose. The next morning, Adrian called his lawyer again. "Nora," he said, his voice clear and certain, "I want to start something. A foundation for kids like Mira. Those the system overlooks. Those who slip through the cracks." She paused. "A nonprofit?" "No," he said softly. "A promise. One that outlives me." Within weeks, the Vale Foundation for Children Without Homes took shape. Part school, part shelter, part sanctuary. And while the press painted him as a hero, he never claimed the title. He knew better. Heroes save the day. Fathers stay. When the opening ceremony came, the city gathered. Journalists, politicians, business magnates, all eager for the billionaire's speech. But it wasn't Adrian who stood at the podium that afternoon. It was Mira. She wore a simple blue dress and her shyest smile, her small hands gripping the microphone. "This place," she began, "is for kids who think the world forgot them." But it didn't, because sometimes someone stops, even when they don't have to. And that can change everything. Adrian watched from the front row, pride swelling quietly in his chest. She had his steadiness now, and her mother's light, the kind of strength no money could buy. When she finished, she looked down at him and mouthed, "We're safe now." He smiled back, but inside he knew the truth. They weren't just safe. They were whole. That night, as snow began to fall again, soft this time, gentle as forgiveness, Adrian stood by the window, watching the city glow. For the first time, he didn't see towers or profits or rivals. He saw lives, small flickers of light scattered across the dark, all waiting for someone to notice. And he whispered to the glass, to the reflection of the man he had once been, "You can rest now. You finally did something that mattered." Down the hall, Mira's laughter carried through the house. It sounded like spring. Months passed, and Chicago bloomed into spring, streets alive again, children's laughter chasing the last of winter's shadows. Yet for Adrian Vale, the city had never looked so different. It wasn't the skyline or the sunlit streets that changed. It was the man seeing them. Where he once measured worth in towers and profits, he now found it in mornings that began with pancakes and crayons, and nights that ended with a child's laughter echoing down hallways once too quiet to hold joy. Mira had grown in ways that couldn't be measured by height. Her drawings had changed too, no longer haunted by snow and broken windows. Now there were gardens, open skies, hands reaching instead of hiding. Every wall in the penthouse had become her gallery, each page a piece of her healing stitched into color. One morning, she bounded into the kitchen holding a sealed envelope. Her eyes shimmered with that same spark that first night in the diner, fierce, uncertain hope. "Mr. Adrian," she said. She still called him that sometimes when she wanted to sound serious. "The teacher said I should read this to you." He wiped his hands on a towel and sat at the counter. "Go on." She unfolded the letter, the paper shaking just a little. They picked my essay for the city showcase. The topic was, "Who Changed My World?" She hesitated, glancing up shyly. "It's about you," Adrian smiled. "Then I'd better hear it." She read aloud. "Some people change the world by building things. Some change it by stopping to help someone who's fallen. He didn't just give me food. He gave me back the idea that I matter. And that's how you change everything." Her voice faltered at the last line. When she finished, the silence between them was thick, trembling with unspoken emotion. Adrian swallowed hard. For a man who had once commanded thousands, words suddenly felt too small. "You changed mine too," he said quietly. "More than you know." That afternoon, they walked together to the community center, now proudly bearing the sign, the Vale Foundation, a home for every child. The building had once been an abandoned warehouse. Now its windows glowed with light and laughter. Inside, volunteers unpacked books, painted murals, and arranged beds for the new arrivals. Mira ran ahead, helping place stuffed animals on pillows. Adrian watched from the doorway, the girl who had once begged for Noodles now giving comfort to others. She moved with the same gentle assurance he'd once lacked, a rhythm of kindness learned by living it. Reporters gathered near the stage, their cameras ready for another headline. But Adrian didn't want the spotlight anymore. When they asked for a statement, he simply said, "Don't write about me. Write about her." That evening, a small ceremony was held for the opening. The lights dimmed, and Mira stepped onto the stage again, clutching the same sketchbook she'd carried through every chapter of her life. Behind her, projected on the wall, was one of her drawings, a house under a golden sun, its door open wide, children standing hand in hand. "This," she said softly into the microphone, "is what home looks like when people don't give up on each other." Then she smiled toward Adrian in the front row, the same quiet, world-changing smile that had first melted the ice around his heart. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet. Applause filled the hall, but Adrian barely heard it. His eyes were on her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything he'd kept buried: pride, love, redemption. Later that night, as they drove home under a soft drizzle, Mira leaned against him, half asleep. "Do you think Mom can see us?" she whispered. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "If she can," he said, voice thick. "She's proud of you." "Of us," she smiled drowsily. "Then we're safe forever." When they reached home, she fell asleep on the couch, still holding her sketchbook. Adrian covered her with a blanket and stood by the window, looking out over the city that had once mirrored his emptiness. Now it reflected something else, lights glowing not just in buildings, but in lives touched by one small act of compassion. Snow began to fall again, faint, almost invisible like memory. It melted before it touched the ground. He whispered to the quiet room, "You were right, Mira. Kindness changes everything." On the mantel hung her latest drawing, two figures standing beneath an open sky, surrounded by children, their arms stretched wide. Above them, in bold, uneven letters, it read, "We help others feel safe now." Adrian smiled, his eyes glistening. The empire he had once built from glass and greed had finally transformed into something far stronger, not a monument of power, but of purpose. And somewhere between the falling snow and the steady beat of a child's heart asleep on his couch, Adrian Vale understood the truth that had eluded him all his life. You don't measure a man by the world he owns, but by the warmth he leaves behind.